Today, I have the honor of speaking with one of the most influential figures in American foreign policy over the past several decades, Ambassador John Bolton. He has served in key roles across multiple U.S. administrations, including those of President Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and the first term of Donald Trump. Ambassador Bolton, thank you for joining me. It's a real privilege to have you here, so let's get started.
Great, glad to be with you.
Thank you. With the MAGA movement taking over the Republican Party, where is the next generation of Ronald Reagans, Dick Cheneys, and John Boltons? Will they eventually rise, or do you believe the MAGA movement has permanently reshaped the political structure of the United States?
Yeah, I think it's a big mistake for many analysts who have concluded that Trump has fundamentally changed the Republican Party and American politics. I think Trump is an aberration. It's certainly true that across American history, there have been populist movements of one kind or another. There have been isolationist periods in American foreign policy. And there's always been a strain of isolationism in the Republican Party, as there is in the Democratic Party, although of a somewhat different perspective. I think that in the current environment, Trump has a significant hold on particularly elected Republicans in the House of Representatives and the Senate. I think they are more intimidated by him than anything else. They don't want to see a pro-Trump primary opponent running against them, looking now toward the 2026 congressional elections. But I think in almost all cases, these representatives still hold to a Reagan-Bush approach. They still accept what Reagan called peace through strength. In fact, it's a very powerful brand, so that Trump has adopted it too, even though he doesn't really understand what it means. So I think there will be a struggle for the 2028 Republican nomination. I don't think J.D. Vance has it locked up by any stretch of the imagination. And I think we'll see then a resurgence, a kind of snapback to a Reaganite outlook as Trump's term in office comes to an end. And everyone should remember, although he's still relatively a new president at this point, he's also a lame duck president. He's all but admitted now in a recent NBC interview he's not going to run for a third term. He's even described J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio as possible successors. And I think the way he's behaving in a number of policy areas show that the electoral guardrail that he had in his first term, he doesn't see restraining him anymore. He's not worried about ever having to stand for re-election.
Thank you. In 2016 primaries, I was hoping for Ted Cruz to win the GOP nomination. In 24, I was hoping for Nikki Haley. But when she didn't get the Republican nomination, I preferred Harris over Trump, as did many others on the right, including some prominent Republicans. What has happened to the Republican Party that the establishment Democrat like Harris now seems closer to the core Republican principles than the person who actually won the GOP nomination?
Well, I think in both 2016 and 2024, the way that Republicans and Democrats nominate their presidents, which is really fairly similar, worked in favor of Trump, even though I don't think a majority of Republicans favored him. As in 2016, there were many, many people who aspired for the nomination. People thought Governor DeSantis of Florida might win, but his campaign did not launch successfully. And we went through pretty much the same pattern that happened in 2016, that Trump emerged after one after another of his opponents fell by the wayside. So it shows what happens when you have a less than a majority, but a strongly held view of 25 to 35% of the party. That turned out to be enough to win the nomination. I don't think that group will stay together for anybody other than Donald Trump, which is one reason why I think in 2028 the nomination will be much more open. And I think Harris looked acceptable only by comparison with Trump. I think a lot of people who did vote for Harris did it with their teeth gritted. I didn't vote for either one of them. I wrote in Mike Pence. But I think in 2028, there will be a wide open contest for the Republican nomination, probably for the Democrats too.
Considering Trump's vengeful mandate, replacing meritocracy with blind loyalty, borderline unconstitutional conduct, economic decline, and the damage done on the international stage to America's global alliances, do you now think that voting for Kamala Harris might have been the better option? And with the benefit of hindsight, would you have considered supporting her?
No, I have a kind of a threshold I think people have to meet before I could consider voting for them. It goes to basic competence and something having to do with their views. And I don't think either one of them made it over that threshold. And I know there are probably far more Republicans who gritted their teeth and voted for Donald Trump than they did for Harris because they feared that another 4 years with her in the White House basically carrying out Biden policies or something even more to the left could have damaged the country permanently. So there were a lot of people in the 2024 election who weren't satisfied with either choice and who just wish that the system could have come up with any other candidates that they could have voted for. So I think the dissatisfaction is pretty intense, and there are a lot of people who are very unhappy with the way the opening months of the Trump administration, the second Trump term, have rolled out, and I think we'll see more opposition to Trump as time goes on, particularly from Republicans. Democrats are like an EKG graph that's gone flatline. I mean, they've all but disappeared as an opposition party. That's not good for the system either. I'm sure they'll recover. The danger is that their extreme left wing could end up as the dominant force, which ultimately can't be good for the country under any circumstances.
In modern times, since the fall of Soviet Union, isolationist voices in the US were mostly seen as fringe elements on the right, represented by paleo-conservatives like Pat Buchanan and libertarian maximalists like Congressman Ron Paul. How is that these once marginal isolationist ideas have now come to dominate the contemporary Republican Party?
Well, I think they've come to dominate the Trump administration. I really don't think, in looking either at the elected side of the party or the party base out in the country, that that's accurate. I think the war in Ukraine was a factor because people were dissatisfied with the way Biden conducted his aid to the Ukrainians, and the isolationists were able to take care of it. But I think if someone other than Trump or other than Vance became president tomorrow, a Republican, and said, we need to stand by the Ukrainians, we need to do more against the Iranians, the North Koreans, and the Chinese, I think the parties would snap back into something that looks a lot more like their respective positions during the Cold War than we've seen in recent years. Trump has had an effect on the configuration of American politics that's undeniable. I just don't think it's anything like a permanent change.
On one hand, the US wants to retain its global leadership role, yet it is run by the isolationist MAGA movement. Global ambitions are coupled with isolationist principles. So how do you reconcile these two opposing views?
Well, I don't think you can, which is ultimately why I don't think Trump or Vance succeed. And we've just had a very interesting case study, and it's not finished, it's not concluded yet, but that is the exchange of military action between Pakistan and India. A few days after the crisis began, J.D. Vance said that situation has absolutely nothing to do with us. And yet, in the last days, a combination of Vance and Marco Rubio, and I'm sure efforts by other countries as well, resulted in a ceasefire. Now, the ceasefire is unsteady. It may not hold. It remains a tense situation. But at least according to the way Vance and Rubio and others tell it, they were making phone calls all through the night in an effort to convince Pakistan and India to engage in a ceasefire. So after that effort, which was necessary because any kind of conflict between two nuclear powers that starts at a conventional level could escalate, it is of national interest to the United States to make sure that war doesn't break out without at least trying to stop the parties beforehand. So they had success. You have to acknowledge that, again, at least temporarily. I wonder if something like that, particularly working with Rubio, couldn't have an influence on Vance that, actually this might have been important to the United States. And beginning with that, whether that could change people's minds. It's just an indication that ultimately reality wins over bad policy. And in the case of Trump, the issue is whether and how much the U.S. will suffer until reality finally takes hold.
The MAGA approach to foreign policy often seems short-sighted, focused on immediate gains while ignoring long-term consequences, such as flirting with Russia, hostility toward its Western allies, and undermining NATO. Unlike the traditional conservative right, which built broad international coalitions based on shared values, MAGA politicians appear to reject the idea that values are higher-order interests. Would you agree that alliances rooted in common values, like those with the Western countries as well as Ukraine and Taiwan, are ultimately a greater source of American strength than the transactional interest-first approach embraced by the MAGA movement?
Yeah, I think even somebody widely viewed as the greatest realist in American foreign policy, Henry Kissinger, made it clear that success for America in international affairs comes from melding interests, which you have to take into account, obviously, and values, and that you can't really have one without the other. So one reason that I believe Trump is an aberration whose effects certainly on foreign policy in particular will fade is that he doesn't have any overarching philosophy at all. He doesn't do grand strategy. He doesn't even understand policy as we conventionally understand that term. Everything with him is transactional and ad hoc, and he sees the world through the prism of personal relationships, not through the prism of policy. So he thinks he's friends with Vladimir Putin, which I don't think is what Putin thinks, but that's what Trump thinks, and therefore, in Trump's mind, U.S.-Russian relations are good. He had bad personal relationships with Angela Merkel, with Theresa May, with Justin Trudeau. And as a consequence, U.S. relations with those countries suffered for no good reason. So since Trump's approach is so idiosyncratic, so ad hoc, there isn't any philosophy for him to leave for someone else to inherit. And therefore, I think the party will snap back, hopefully fairly quickly, to a more Reaganite overall approach.
When asked about Putin being a killer, Trump once replied, "Well, we kill people too." That kind of relativism has since been adopted in some MAGA circles. One would expect these kinds of statements and arguments to come from the radical pacifists left. These are third world talking points, yet they are now parroted on the right. This is a sharp break from the traditional Republican worldview shaped by thinkers like Charles Krauthammer, who saw America as a benevolent hegemon, a force for global stability, security, and prosperity. Instead, MAGA rhetoric often sounds anti-American when discussing US foreign policy. How do you see this shift, and what can be done to mitigate these toxic tendencies on the American right of all places?
Well, I think in part it stems from the fact many of the supporters of this isolationist point of view know next to nothing about international affairs. They don't understand the benefits that we get here in America from having a strong international position. They think we're doing this purely out of altruism. Trump himself is the best example. He doesn't understand how NATO, how the alliance works. He thinks basically the U.S. defends Europe. We get nothing out of it, and the Europeans won't pay. But that's not how a functioning NATO actually operates. There's enormous benefits for the United States, as there are with our bilateral alliances with countries like Japan and South Korea. We're not doing this out of altruism. We're doing it because it's in our national interest, and it's in the national interest of all the other members of NATO. So I think if people had a better understanding of the wider world, you wouldn't hear a lot of this. And it certainly is strange, because if you mask the identities of some of the people who say these things, you would think they were from the left wing of the Democratic Party. That's the distorting effect that Trump has, and I just think it's not sustainable.
Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is often wrongly portrayed in the US as a culture war issue, rather than what it truly is, an imperial war of aggression fueled by Soviet-era nostalgia for a greater Russia. Russian disinformation campaign promotes this culture war narrative to muddy the waters and portray the conflict as a clash between a decadent West and a traditional East, with the goal of undermining support for Ukraine. Why do some prominent mainstream figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson fall for or even amplify this narrative? And what strategies can be used to immunize Western societies against the spread of these toxic and manipulative narratives?
Well, it's a reflection of a very successful Russian propaganda effort, and it's used again against people who have no basis on which they can understand that they're listening to propaganda. They don't know enough about the outside world to see how untrue it is. In fact, in Russia, there's an enormous internal crisis going on. It's not that Vladimir Putin is at all threatened. He remains internally in a very strong position. But many Russians know this is not the right direction for them to be going in. Unfortunately, a lot of them are in exile now. But I think if Putin disappeared from the political scene tomorrow, you would see in Russia an enormous debate about what the future would be. It's not inevitable that it will continue in this direction to try and resurrect the Russian Empire. Many Russians already are very worried about how close Russia's getting with China and how difficult it might be to avoid just being lost in as a very junior partner in a Chinese-led axis. So it's unclear on the Russian side what their future is going to be. And for those in this country who don't understand, there's no culture war aspect about this at all. The invasion was unprovoked aggression to recreate an empire in a vision that's really almost medieval in its origins. And it requires political leaders in the United States to make this case, to explain to citizens. The unfortunate fact is, since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, too many people in the U.S. in both parties have thought that we had reached the end of history, as some said, and that we didn't face external challenges. So we don't have, at this point, as good a political set of leaders who can explain to the American people why the burdens of this international involvement ultimately benefit them far more than they realize.
There is no disputing that the fact that the US had every right to respond after 9/11. That was both just and justified. However, do you think that the broader American interventions in the Middle East were truly worth the capital spent in terms of resources, lost lives, and the reputational cost to the US on the world stage? Because it seems that the growing public frustration and lack of resolve has made it hard for the US to confront real existential threats, especially considering that Middle East regimes never pose the same level of danger to the West as the Russia-China axis does today. Would you agree that a more surgical use of force could have generated broader domestic and international consensus, and in doing so help prevent the cynicism and war fatigue we now see among many Americans, particularly within the MAGA movement?
Well, I think the problem with the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq were that they weren't adequately explained to the American people. That these were efforts to maintain security, certainly in the case of removing the Taliban, which had given al-Qaeda a refuge in Afghanistan. Removing them meant that Afghanistan would no longer be a base for terrorist operations that could strike the US or Europe or anywhere else. That was entirely a sensible thing to do. And overthrowing Saddam Hussein, I remain convinced was the right thing to do because of his objectives, without doubt, ultimately to continue pursuing weapons of mass destruction. But I think this is a case where the absence of effective political leaders in the U.S. to make the case to the American people why we were involved, not to paint it in abstract humanitarian terms, although there were many benefits that we conveyed both in Afghanistan and Iraq to give them the opportunity to move toward representative government. But these were also actions based on hardcore American interests. The fault substantively, I think, was not following through, having the Ayatollahs in Iran surrounded on the east and the west by regimes that were friendly to the United States, that we didn't worry more then about their pursuit of nuclear weapons and their state sponsorship of terrorism to create terrorist proxies like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, which we've now seen in operation after October the 7th. So I'm not saying that there weren't mistakes made, but I think the strategic analysis that formed our policy in the early 2000s was correct. We didn't follow it through, and we certainly didn't make, not only didn't we make the domestic case for it effectively, but didn't make the international case as effectively as we should have either.
Last question, Mr. Ambassador. The EU, by design, is made up of member states with diverse national interests, which intrinsically limits its ability to act quickly and with a unified voice. That is why Europe needs US leadership to be geopolitically effective. At the same time, the only way for the US to maintain its global primacy in the 21st century is by leading a united Western bloc with the EU as a key partner. China understands this and fears a unified West more than any individual nation. Do you agree with this perspective, and do today's American elites truly understand it?
Well, I think the question of how to structure and lead the Western alliance is critical and always has been. During the Cold War, it was a key Soviet objective to split the West, which they failed to do. And I think one of the reasons they lost the Cold War was that they failed to split the West. So the last thing we need here is to do this for them, particularly as we look at the evolving China-Russia axis. I think the EU, if it remained focused on economic issues like being a free trade bloc in and of itself, would make a lot of sense. But the idea that you can force, in effect, EU members to become part of one nation, and that the EU bureaucracy in Brussels will evolve into a continent-wide government, I think is very unrealistic. And I think those Europeans who follow this theology of the EU being a state under construction, with the attendant consequences of it being a military force as well, are making a mistake. I think the way Charles de Gaulle originally saw it, he called it a Europe des patries, a Europe of countries, is the strongest way to go. And I think strong member nations in NATO as the military representation of the North Atlantic, and which could be broadened, I think, to add Asian countries, add Japan, add Australia, Singapore, Israel. I think you could make NATO more global, and maybe that's what we need to do given the emerging China-Russia axis.
Mr. Ambassador, before we finish, I'd like to end by sharing one of your quotes, a very powerful quote I believe our audience needs to hear. If the American isolationists of today come to dominate our foreign policy, it will in effect erase America's support for the principles that have guided us for so long. The world will miss us when we are gone. Ambassador Bolton, thank you for your time and for this interview.
Well, thank you very much for having me.